This is the next thing, is the book memorization myth. And I don't say this because it's an actual myth that it's impossible to memorize a book, because you definitely can memorize the book. The problem is having that as a goal, thinking that's what's important, is to memorize a book. What's really important is information structure, understanding the systems and the frameworks. No matter what subject you're learning, there's a framework. There's maybe multiple frameworks, multiple perspectives, and each one has its own framework. And so you can use those. But it's really important to first focus on synthesizing that information and creating your own understanding, your own framework and system for how to understand that subject. And you can't just take a structure out of a book and hopefully the book that you're reading even has a structure. There's lots of books that really don't have a coherent structure. That's a real problem, because if you memorize that information without a structure, you still don't really understand what you're talking about, what you're learning about. So until you have that structure, until you have that system, you really haven't learned much. You don't really understand much. So your primary objective is to first figure out how that system works, how that framework works. Then everything else is going to be built on top of that. So don't memorize information until you have that structure built, which means that you should not be memorizing any one book and whatever structure it happens to use. You should be adapting the information from that book to fit the synthesized framework that you've come up with. That's the only way where you're going to have an integrated model of how the entire system works. Otherwise, you're wasting your time, because you're just organizing it in this haphazard fashion. Each book that you quote unquote memorize is going to be structured in a completely different way, and they're not going to connect together into one larger picture, which is what you're going for. That's where real understanding comes from. So there's going to be a significant delay between reading stuff, taking notes, and then synthesizing multiple sets of notes from multiple different sources until you have something that really looks like a complete model, complete framework that you're happy with. And in some industries, in some places, nobody's yet come up with that framework. Nobody's come up with that system yet. So maybe that's your role, is to be an innovator and come up with that. So don't just assume that because there's quote unquote experts in every field means that they've come up with the ultimate formula. There were experts hundreds of years ago in astronomy and in the medical field, really in every field, who had no idea what the real truths were that we're discovering today, and we've discovered in the last few decades with all the technology that we have access to now. So the same is true today. There's lots of theories that will eventually be proven wrong, and just because we're on the cutting edge of what technology has right now doesn't mean a lot of things aren't going to change in the future. So you also have to be comfortable with, okay, I'm 80%, 90% sure this is good enough of a framework. I've done enough research where I'm pretty sure there isn't anything significantly better out there. And then just be happy with good enough, and don't go for perfectionism, and don't delay unnecessarily. So make sure you're getting at least 3 different valid, good, different perspectives on an issue, on a subject. And then at a certain point, you'll just get a feeling. This is something over time, as you research more and more different areas and different subjects, you'll start to get a feeling for, is there something more out there, or have I really basically turned over all the stones and found just about everything that's out there? And this is one of the reasons why Google Images is such an important tool, because it's going to expose you very quickly to a lot of different frameworks in a visual format. Eventually, if you scroll down far enough in Google Images, they just stop showing you any more results. And that's what I do. Anytime I'm learning a new subject, I'm going to go through all of those results until it just stops showing me things. And that's when I'll feel like, okay, I've looked at enough things where I've probably seen every different model that's out there. Anything that's relevant, anything that's even marginally important, has to have shown up in those first, whatever, if hundreds, maybe it's 500 different results there. So that's kind of gives you an idea of the level of research you should be doing to really be sure that you have the right framework, because that framework is so important, and if you get it wrong, it's a big mistake. Another question is, what's worth memorizing? Is the stuff that you're reading even worth memorizing? So These are the things that are most important to memorize, and then go from the top, and then things that are maybe less important to memorize at the bottom. And when I say memorize, what it really means is you have to decide what aspects of these things you want to memorize. So maybe vocabulary that's very rarely used isn't something that you need to memorize right now, or maybe you just need to memorize enough to understand the broad themes right now, and then when you do a second pass later on, then you can go into more of the details. But things like systems, things like principles that you're going to see over and over and over again, those need to be memorized. You need to have those, and they need to be built into your brain, because those are going to influence so many different decisions you make. Labels and vocabulary are also very important, because otherwise you can't make distinctions between two different things. You can't see the contrast that exists there. So if you can't recognize the pattern, then you can't do anything about it. You can't make a decision based on the difference between two things if you don't have labels or vocabulary for those two things. And well, you can, I mean, technically you can, even if you don't have words for two different shades of a color of orange, doesn't mean you can't tell the difference. But what it does mean is you can't really do anything useful with that. You can't talk to somebody about getting an exact color of paint you want. It's very difficult because you don't have a vocabulary to talk about and think about and store those distinctions. Things like examples, those can be useful more for review than for total memorization most of the time. It really depends on what area you're in. Sometimes examples are really good to memorize, such as if you're learning a musical instrument and you want to memorize a certain song. So you find a good song, you find a video of somebody playing it, and then you watch that over and over again and use that as an example. Same with role models. If you see a role model exhibiting any sort of behavior, doing anything that you want to model, or they have a certain mindset or way of seeing things, then that's something where having an exact replica, being able to replicate that perfectly, is one of the first stages that you want to go through in order to make that skill or make that behavior part of who you are, and eventually have it become, kind of add your own twist to it. But starting out, the best thing to do is to mimic it perfectly, so you can make sure that you're getting everything that's there. And a lot of times, until you can mimic it, you're actually not modeling the entire thing. You're missing things. There's some things that you don't understand well enough to model yet, and so that tells you where there's some holes in your understanding, where there's some weaknesses, and then you can focus on fixing those. And if you're interested in modeling, putting out a course on how to model experts, people that are good at different subjects, and I've been doing this for years, and it's a big part of how I learn, because there's a lot of things that just aren't taught because nobody really understands them yet, and they're just considered like these intangible skills. So a lot of my method for learning those type of skills and that type of information is to go directly to the source and just look at videos, any sort of recordings, and go from there. There's also things that, and I've talked about this quite a bit in the note-taking course, about how there's a lot of stuff like checklists, like raw data, multi-step techniques or strategies where you only need to use it once or maybe twice. It's not worth memorizing that. You just write it down on a piece of paper, put it in your computer, and you just need a good information management system. And all that is having different categories so that you know where to put stuff when you're done with it and where to find it when you're looking for it. That's all it is. It's just that way of categorizing stuff into different folders. Then there's this piece, which is memory is just scaffolding. And this is one of the things that I learned the hard way when I first got into mnemonics. And what I realized is, just because you have this stuff and it's accessible through a memory palace doesn't mean you actually understand it. That's just the first stage. It's actually just another method of spaced repetition, where if you don't have any sort of writing implement, you have no way of writing things down. It's the best way to get spaced repetitions. And yeah, you will forget a few things, but if you're studious and you do those spaced repetitions immediately, then you will only forget a few percent, probably less than 5% or 10% of what you originally start out with. So it's still a pretty reliable system. But the important thing is understanding that it's just scaffolding, and that knowledge needs to be, and those ideas need to be interconnected and weaved within each other. So they need to be connected like a web, like the internet is connected. They can't just be these individual ideas just stored away. Because what happens is you have all this stuff memorized and you can spout it off, or you can write down on a list of paper, like a list of 50 different things or 100 different things completely from memory, and it seems really impressive. The problem is when you go out and you live your life and maybe you memorize 50 principles of something, you realize your behavior actually hasn't changed and your thinking hasn't changed, which is the bigger issue, is that you've memorized all this stuff, but it's not actually influencing your thinking or your behavior. It's just kind of locked away in this random little cubby or random little closet that you're never actually accessing. So it's completely irrelevant to your learning. You're not actually getting a change. So it's really important to realize that it's just scaffolding. It's just holding that information in your brain and giving you the opportunity to start connecting that information once you have access to it. That's why this idea of information architecture, structuring information, building this information infrastructure in your brain is so important. These frameworks. You have to start with the framework and build on top of that. And a lot of people don't want to do that. They just want to memorize individual pieces of information. And this can be fine for certain applications like vocabulary, like just memorizing things that you need to pass a test. It's one of the best ways to do it, especially if you don't need to retain it long term. But if you need to retain it long term, if you really need to understand it deeply, you're best off structuring it properly. And we'll be talking more about that later. But this stuff is really important for things like problem solving, for things like generalizing so that you can actually use it. Another thing is detailed rehearsal. And you can't always actually practice something to get it right. For example, you can't simulate on Earth zero-G environments. So you can kind of fly people up and do a parabolic thing, but you can't really prepare people for doing something like landing on the moon and doing stuff in space. You can simulate it to a certain degree, but you can't really get there. So that's an example of people practice in various ways and rehearse things and maybe visualize, but they only really get one chance to actually do it. And so when there's situations like that, the best you can do is rehearse. The best you can do is visualize it, repeat it over and over in your head. There's stories about, Arnold Schwarzenegger talks about how every time before he lifted, he was visualizing himself doing it, because a lot of his power and strength actually came from building the connections between his neurons and the muscles. There's a lot of potential in those muscles that just isn't used because your neurons haven't connected strongly enough to really gain control over all 100% of that muscle strength. And same thing is true with any sort of action that you're taking, is that if you're not structuring the information so that when you actually rehearse it, you have access to it, so that when you actually do it, all the information is there and is stored, then what you're gonna notice is that there's a big difference between knowing what to do and being able to effortlessly do it. And you can get around that with certain things like visualizing yourself doing something over and over again, because what that's doing is it's myelinating the connections that you're going to actually use when you're performing the action for real. But other than that, if you just have information structured like in a mind map, and then you go out and it's like, okay, I'm going to take action now, what happens is the way that you're retrieving information, the order that you're doing it in when you're actually taking action is very different from how you initially structured it and put it into your head. And so there's reorientation that takes place when you do that. And a lot of people don't factor that into their equation because it's more abstract. It's about understanding how that information is actually structured in your head. And until you take conscious control of that, it's not going to be an efficient process where you can predict ahead of time how the way you structure information, the way you memorize information is going to directly affect how easy it is for you to take action on that information. And that's really important because ultimately, if you're not taking action on this stuff, if you're not doing anything with it, what's the point? What's the value of memorizing it anyways? So that's an important thing to think about. We'll be getting more into all this stuff in the coming videos.